But they've always been food. Hey, my darling. I can adopt her. See, she'd love it being my house. We got redheaded children. So she loves redheads.
He's kind of quiet, but he loved her too. I can see it in his face.
Oh, yeah.
He loved her.
We get a kick out of her. I can tell. Honey, don't forget.
Okay. All right, we're in James. And I have us down to James chapter 2 and verse number 10. Okay. They cut the heat off.
They sure
They
did.
must have, because I'm cold.
Mhm.
And you want to know something, it's cool in the other parts of this. And when they turn the heat on, it gets hot in here and those other places. All right. James chapter 2 and verse 10. For whosoever shall keep the whole law. All right. And yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. To observe carefully and keep it tenaciously. Now, if you're going to appeal to the old law or any part of it, that means that you must keep it all. Now, there's a difference between Romans chapter 15 and verse 4, whatsoever things are written aforetime were written for our learning. If we're using it as a learning process, then there's no problem. Here's how God deals with sin. You know, Jesus is our Passover, 1 Corinthians chapter 5. How do you find out about that? Well, you go to the Old Testament and you find out about those things. But he's doing it as a source of authority. If we're going to go back and say, you've got to do this. Okay, many people do that today in the Ten Commandments. But if you're going to say we've got to keep the Ten Commandments, that means then you've got to keep it all. But understand something. What is the penalty for breaking any one of the Ten Commandments?
Yeah.
That's right. All right. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy is part of the. And I guarantee you, every one of us break the Sabbath day. But if you appeal to any one of the Ten Commandments, you've got to keep that commandment. That commandment, then in Numbers chapter 15, the man picked up sticks on the Sabbath day, and he was stoned to death. Not only him, but his household, and all of those things too. So you got to keep all of it. If you break one point of the law, you are guilty of breaking all the law. So if you're going down here and you're doing speeding or whatever, you'll break every other law that there is. Because you have no regard for the law. You disregard the law.
You must have saw that letter they sent me years ago.
Well, I'm sorry.
That's exactly what they told me.
That's right. So if you break one point, the rest of the law condemns you also. If a person says one part of the law of God's law is important and the other is not, it is presumptuous and has invaded the realm of God.
You ever like to cook? I never believe in things.
All right, verse 11, then he says, for he that said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not kill. Now, if thou commit no adultery, yet if thou kill, thou art become a transgressor of the law. The whole law, not just part of it. The law of God must be treated as a unit and with respect. How do we treat our Bibles? Do we just throw it in the car and leave it there? Okay. If you observe part and neglect part, you are a transgressor of it all. There must have been some that James writing to that thought part of it was true and part of it was important and other parts were not. And such is not the case.
Wasn't that a problem throughout the Old Testament, because Paul was talking to them about the Judaizing teachers.
That's right.
One in Acts where they said you had to be circumcised.
Yes, Acts chapter 15. Now, the old law, and then we didn't get to this in our other class, but I want to do that here. The old law has been done away with. Y'all understand that, don't you? Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 15, and Colossians 2 and verse 14. Ephesians chapter 2, they're parallel passage. That means they, all right. Having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in the ordinance, for to making himself of twain one new man, so making peace. He's abolished then.
Okay, that's Ephesians 2 and
15.
Colossians 2 and 14.
He abolished in his flesh the enmity. That's the law then. He abolished it. He took it out of the way. And now Colossians, that was Colossians 2:14. Blotting out the handwritings of the ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, and nailing it to a cross. Now, if we go to Hebrews chapter 9, and it talks about a will and a testament. When does a will or a testament come into effect?
after the testator died.
That's right. Let's see. For this cause, he is the mediator of the New Testament, that by the means of death, for the redemption of the transgression that were under the first testament, they which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is of force after men are dead. Otherwise, it is of no strength at all while the testator liveth. So he came to this earth. He gave us his last will and testament.
That was Hebrews 9 and
15.
through 17.
And so we're not under the old law. We don't keep sacrifices. We don't do all of those things. One reason we don't is because we can't. We don't know who a priest is. Okay? And that's the importance. You don't have it. And without the priest, you can't offer sacrifices. That's what, what it's all about. All right, verse number 12. So speak ye, and so do as they that shall be judged by the law of liberty. Now, you and I are going to be judged by the law of liberty. We talked about that in chapter 1. He talked about the perfect law of liberty. Okay, verse 25. And that perfect law of liberty is the New Testament. Speak and do in this passage. So speak ye and do are in the present active imperative. That means it is necessary.
What was that tense again?
Present active imperative. That means it's ongoing and that it is a command. And thus, such a designated habitual activity. There is a day of judgment coming. John chapter 5, verses 28 and 29. All that in the grave shall hear his voice. They that have done good of the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, I think it is. Let me look. And verse 10. We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ to receive the things done in this body, according that he hath done, whether it be good or whether it be bad. That's right. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10.
the first one was John
5, 28 and 29.
5, 28, 29, and then second
Corinthians
5,
10.
10.
Romans chapter 14 and verse 12. So every one of us shall give an account of himself to God. So we will give an account of all that we say and do. To speak and do sums up all of man. Okay. Matthew chapter 12. Verses 36 and 37. But I say unto you that every idle word that man shall speak, and they shall give an account thereof in the day of judgment. For by thy words thou shalt be justified, by thy words thou shalt be condemned. The law of liberty is the gospel. James chapter 1 verse 25, we mentioned that. It's called the perfect law of liberty there. Liberty is not license. Liberty does not give us. When we say that we are the land of the free and the home of the brave, there are some things that we cannot do. We say we have freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean freedom of speech. You can't go into a restaurant or to a theater and call fire when there is no fire. Okay, you're violating the law when you do that. In Galatians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Don't go back under the Old Testament. Behold, I say unto you, behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. If you make circumcision part of a religious act, then you aren't doing anything. Really, you're fallen from grace. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 4. And then drop down verses 13 and 14 in the book of Galatians chapter 5. For brethren, we have been called unto liberty, only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serving one another. For the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. You and I will be judged then by the perfect law of liberty. When the books are open, Revelation chapter 20, that means several books will be open. One of them is going to be the Bible. It's not going to be asked, which book did you use? God's already determined that. Verse 13 then, James chapter 2 and verse 13. For he shall have judgment without mercy that showed no mercy, and mercy rejoiceth against judgment. Mercy will be shown to those who have mercy. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 7. If we show no mercy, we receive no mercy. Now he's setting there's something up here. How do we treat the poor?
Be very merciful.
All right. Do we have pity for the poor? If we have no mercy for the poor, then guess what we're going to get? No mercy.
You said it was Matthew 5 and 3.
5:7.
5:7.
Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. He is teaching them so they know how to act, and so they will not be condemned on the day of judgment. Mercy cancels out judgment. Now, I didn't get into this into the introduction, but in James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26, Martin Luther, okay, Reformationist, said that this is a right straw epistle. And this part right here is then a right straw one.
What does that
Means that, what is straw?
mean? Dead grass?
That's right. It has no value, okay? Because what you do with straw is you cut off the head of the whatever plant you've got. And this then is the rest of that plant. And there is no value really in that. Without the head, there's no value in it.
He just said there was no value, but he didn't say it wasn't true.
But he meant that it was not true.
Okay. That it wasn't,
He said that this is the conflict. This is the passage that conflicts with the book of Romans. Now, he was a Roman Catholic, and what the Catholics at that time were doing were selling their indulgences and doing all of those things. And so here's Paul says that faith is without works. That's what he's doing. And then James is going to say faith and works are combined. And they're talking about two different things. But you've got to understand that this is why Martin Luther says that the book of James should not be in your canon. Yeah.
So they really thought that they can sell their indulgences
Yeah.
to save somebody.
Yeah. That's how the cathedrals got built over in Europe, through the sale of indulgences.
Mormons believe you be baptized for the dead.
Romans chapter 4, verses 1 through 6 has to deal with the other passage, the conflict in this. So what Martin Luther's ultimate thing was, there's nothing that you can do to have salvation. And when people ask, what must I do to be saved? There's never either silence or they don't say nothing. There is something then that they must do. And
What did he think you had to do? I mean,
he just said all you have to do is believe, basically.
oh, okay.
And that's why so many people say that all they have to
It's
do
so
is
easy.
believe.
It's a cop-out.
And we're going to notice that in this process. Okay? Some things, some consequences of that doctrine. All right. Now we can do nothing to merit salvation. Titus chapter 3 and verse 5.
And that was freely given by Jesus, right?
Do what?
It was freely given by
That's
Jesus
right.
Christ. So there's nothing we
Not by
did.
works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his own mercy, he saved us. Let me notice there's more to that passage than I just quoted. By the washing of regeneration, by the renewing of the Holy Ghost. Okay. There are works that must be done that God would have us to do. John chapter 6, verses 28 and 29. Here is an important passage for you to remember in this line of dealing with somebody who says that works, that faith is all we have to do. All we have to do is believe. We're going to deal more with that in just a minute, like I said. And then, this is John chapter 6, verse 28 and 29. Then said they unto him, what shall we do that we might work the works of God? And Jesus answered and said unto them, this is the work of God, that you believe on him whom he has sent. So faith is a work of God. And it's not something that God does, it's something that God requires of us. And I think there's a lot of people in this world that think that faith then is a gift that God gives us. That's not what he says. It's required. So then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Romans chapter 10 and verse 17. So we must hear God's word. We must make application to it to our lives. There are people who believe that Jesus is the Christ and are not saved. John chapter 12, 42 and, John chapter 12. Is it 42? Nevertheless, among the chief rulers also many believed on him, but because of the Pharisees, they would not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the praises of men more than the praises of God. That's 42 and 43.
Didn't Felix tell?
Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. He didn't say he had faith. He just said, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And Paul said to him, I would to God that not only thou, but all that hear me this day would both almost and altogether, as I am, accept these bonds.
Well, that's what grieved Paul most, was that his fellow Jewish brethren would not believe.
That's right. Well, understand that he's talking about obedience too. What doth it profit, my brethren? Though a man say he hath faith and hath not works, can faith save him? James chapter 2, verse 14. We started on that, didn't we? Okay. Yeah. All right. They're discussing, Paul and James are discussing two types of works. Paul's works exclude God's plan to save. James includes James includes works that God has for us to do to be saved. We cannot glory in our works. That's what Paul would say. While works includes faith. That's what James says.
Wait a minute, you said Paul's works exclude the plan of salvation?
Excludes God's plan to be saved. Notice what he says in Romans chapter 4.
Or what did he say in chapter 6?
But you understand that he's talking about things different in chapter 6 than he is chapter 4. Okay, what shall we say then? Abraham our father, as pertaining to the flesh, hath found. For Abraham was justified by what he's asking the question. For if Abraham were justified by works, he hath whereof to glory, but not before God. For what saith the scriptures? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. What did Abraham do? He obeyed. Okay.
So he still had to do something.
That's right. And really, it's not any different. Paul's not any different than what James is. And Martin Luther has thrown a monkey wrench in this and saying these things.
He's taking verses out not only out of context, but he's just taking a few verses.
But Paul's also saying that we cannot glory. Okay, I have faith. Okay, James says, show me thy faith without thy works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. Okay.
So you have faith, devils believe in truth.
All right, haven't got there. Okay, but that's what he's going to talk about. You know, that's why I said there are several who believed and are not saved. Just because you believe, that doesn't. There's more to this than just faith only. Humble submission to God, to the will of God, is expressed in obeying his commands. And that demonstrates then complete reliance upon God, not oneself. What works are done in baptism? In baptism, it's total submission. That person who's doing the baptizing can drown you if he wants to, and there's not a thing you can do about it. Okay? I baptize lots of folks. Number one, when folks being baptized, try to break this. I said, look in that water. You see anybody floating in that water? I said, I hadn't lost one in that water yet. Okay. I took, I'm take you down, bring you back up. That's all right. So it's total submission. The person being baptized is not doing anything but submitting. Two questions asked by James. Profit means increase and denotes advantage or blessings. Profit means increase and denotes advantage or blessings. What good is it to have faith but not followed by proof? Show me your faith by your works. James chapter 2, verse 18. Faith only is never taught in the Bible. The type of faith that saves is a type that conforms itself in obedience to God's command. The second question is asked so that a negative reply will be given. James is saying if one keeps on saying he has faith, but keeps on not having works, can his faith save him? No. Hebrews chapter 11 demonstrates the kind of faith that James is discussing. By faith, Abraham. By faith, Noah. By faith. Okay, goes on and on. And then Hebrews chapter 12 saying, seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Faith that saves must be demonstrated, and that has been true throughout the ages. Verse 15. Here's an illustration. If a brother or sister be naked or destitute of daily food, here's an illustration of faith and works. Here's a fellow Christian without proper clothing or proper nourishment. What are we going to do? Verse 16. And one of you saying to them, depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding ye give them not those things which are needful to the body, what doth it profit? All right. Let this be done. And here he is then, a heartless individual. He is telling his brother or sister to go their way and fend for themselves. And he shall not, and he has all that is needed to help that individual. Those things that are needful may include medicine, nursing care, any of those things. The words depart in peace, be warmed and filled are empty, meaningless gestures, warm words with icy rejection of responsibility. There is no profit in such words. One is not warmed by good wishes, and the stomach is not filled with this greeting. Verse 17. Even so, faith, if it has not works, is dead being alone. This goes back to verse 14. Even so means in like manner. There is no good for this brother or sister above, neither is faith without works. If faith keeps on not having any works, there is no profit. Faith without works is dead. It is incomplete. It is partial and fragmentary. Faith without works is dead, being incomplete, partial, and fragmentary. It is no more alive than the body without the spirit. Verse 26. In Acts chapter 10, verses 34 and 35, God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation, he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted of him. He must work righteousness. Something that man must do. What must I do to be saved? You got to do something, and you will understand, I've got to do something. Now, what must I do to be saved? Okay.
You know, it's like someone offering you a plate of food. It doesn't do you good at all. They just stand there and hold it, you don't eat it.
Yeah.
So they offer you God's offering us salvation, so unless we take it, it's not going to do us any good.
That's like man drowning. Throw out the lifeline. You have a choice. Either accept it or reject it. Now, what are you going to do with the lifeline? All right, verse 18. Yea, a man may say, thou hast faith, and I have works. Show me thy faith without thy works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. This is an objector to what James is saying. One of these individuals is emphasizing his faith while the other is emphasizing his works. James is saying both are necessary. Yes, I am. The objector thinks that faith can show loyalty to God, and the other shows loyalty by his works, discounting the other in each case. The objector thinks that both are pious and devout in God's sight. The objector's thinking is that faith can exist apart from works. But listen to the inspired James. Faith cannot be seen. It is like love. I can tell you I love you. That doesn't mean much. Okay? It's got to be backed up with action. There must be action to show faith or love. Faith and works are so related that one cannot have one without the other. And to me, this verse answers that question to those who say all you have to have is faith in order to believe, or in order to be saved. Thou believest that there is one God, thou doest well. The devils believed and trembled. What does your faith cause you to do? When's the last time you trembled? You believed so much that it caused you to actually shake. Okay. So the objector is still being addressed in this verse, and he's saying, let's test your theory. If you are saying that faith can save without works, then what is the position of the devils? Are they in a saved condition? I had one lady told me yes. That closed the study. She said, all you have to do is believe. So I said, well, let me ask you a question. If that's the case, the devils believe. Are the devils saved? She said yes.
That means that she don't believe in hell.
She believes in universal salvation. That's right. Not only did the devils believe, but let me tell you something. The devils confessed that Jesus is the Christ. Mark chapter 1, verse 4. Other places.
Also, to a degree, Satan obeyed, because he did it with Job. God told him how far he could go, and that's as far as he went.
That's right. Belief in this verse is mental assent. The devils knew that Jesus was the Son of God. The devils confessed that Jesus was the Son of God. The scriptures have always taught that there is one God. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4. The devils believed this and confessed this. Mark chapter 1 and verse 24, 34, 5 and 7, and Luke 4, 41. It is good that you, the objector, believe that there is only one God. To believe that God is one is not enough. Not only, but also believe, and they trembled with fear in their contemplation of who God is. Tremble is the terror that causes one hair to stand on end. Have we got that much conviction that Jesus is the Son of God? The devils believe, but that is all. They will not exhibit their faith in obedience to God. Verse 20. But thou wilt know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead. Here's the conclusion of the argument to the objector. Know there, in this passage, is coming to knowledge. Vain man is an empty-headed one. If you think that faith without works is sufficient, then you are empty-headed. It is barren because it is dead, and that which is dead is unable to produce. Now he's going to prove his point by illustrations. All right. Verse 21. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar? All right. Genesis chapter 22. Really need to go back and start with Genesis 15 and read Genesis chapter 15, Genesis chapter 17, where circumcision is given and how Abraham obeyed God. Abraham, the father of the Hebrew race, is now used as an example of faith and works. Abraham was justified. He was pronounced or declared to be right with God. He was in a right relationship with God. Abraham was in no state of alienation from God because he showed his faith in God. He was doing what God wanted. Abraham was justified by works, by what he did. And he didn't do anything meritorious. He just did what God asked him to do. Take your son, your only son, go over here and offer him for a sacrifice. What did he do? Got the lad, and he and the lad went yonder and worshiped. God knew that Abraham believed, but was justified because he declared his faith in God by doing what God wanted done. Now, Abraham may not have understood what God wanted, but he had enough faith in God and his promises to obey God and know what God wanted. Now, Abraham knew that through this son, this only son, then, the promise was to him. And through his seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed. Now, God's telling him to go kill this son. What's that going to do with Abraham? Well, if I kill this son, then that means the promise is not going to come. You know, God's got a problem with this. Not my problem. God's got a problem with this. That's right. He did that. And he did. But he knew what he had to obey God. And that's what we need to understand too. We need to obey God. We need to understand. He told us to be baptized. We may understand everything about that. That doesn't make any difference. Guess what we need to do? That's right. Yeah. And sometimes we ask too many questions. Abraham's justification and his offering of his sons occurred simultaneously. Abraham's justification and his offering his son occurred simultaneously. That's why when you ask a person when were they saved and when they were baptized, some people may think that's two different occasions. But it's not. You were saved when you were baptized. Mark 16, 15 and 16. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. You're saved when you're baptized. That's right. All right, verse 22. Seest thou how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect? Wrought with is to cooperate with. So faith and works were cooperating with each other, resulting in Abraham's justification. He believed God and he was doing what God said, therefore he was justified. Now, he wasn't doing anything like I said, to merit salvation. Made perfect there. The perfect means then to complete, to finish. Faith continues to exercise with works, and without, and out of these, faith is made complete. Faith nor works can justify in and of themselves. They must cooperate together. And that's what he's talking about. All right, verse 23. And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. This is Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6. God had promised a son. He had no son and was up in years, but he believed what God said. Here's a man, his wife is 90 years old. All right. Can you imagine a woman 90 years old giving birth? And that's what she said too. But guess what? She got pregnant by Abraham. And they had a son, just like God said. Okay. God had promised a son. He had no son and was up in years, and he believed what God said. It was later that his faith was made perfect when he offered up Isaac, Genesis chapter 22. Imputed means he put this on his account. God counted Abraham as righteous, doing right. God accepted Abraham's offering as proof of his devotion. And God counted Abraham as a friend because he was submissive to his will.
Wait a minute, you said faith was shown something. I started writing and then you said imputed. You defined imputed. What was right before the definition of imputed?
It was later that his faith was made perfect when he offered up Isaac in Genesis chapter 22. You okay, Seth? You okay?
Thank you, sorry.
Okay.
My face was funny, sorry about
All
that.
right, you look like you were in deep thought.
Sorry.
Do you have a question?
No.
Well, this tells you right there where it says that Abraham had already offered Isaac up in his mind,
That's Hebrews 11.
that he, that shows you where, that your heart has got to be in the right place. Because Abraham's heart was in the right place.
You see, that's what a lot of people don't understand. They'll holler, well, God know my heart. He know I believe in my heart. That's not the heart he's talking about. This heart can't believe anything. This is the heart that
That's
he's
right.
talking about.
As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he.
They don't understand. Those kind of people don't understand the eternity of the soul.
Why did they turn the heat off? Oh,
I don't know, but I'm afraid.
Me too. These long
I'll be
bodies
sitting
hurt.
at the parking lot.
These long bodies hurt.
Verse 24.
Already hurt.
You see then how that by faith, he see then how that by works a man is justified, and not by faith alone. Here's the only way, or faith only. Here's the only time that faith only is used, and it's not used in the sense that these folks want us to be. Abraham was in faithful compliance with the commands of God. James' conclusion is established by many ways. One of them by analogy, verses 14 through 16.
You said this is James.
James' conclusion is established in many ways. Number one is analogy,
Okay.
verses 14 through 16. Number two is demonstration, verses 17 through 18. And number three is example, verses 19 and then 21 through 23. Number four, inspired affirmation, verses 14 through 26.
What was that? What verses?
14 through 26.
That's inspired affirmation.
Number five, by appeal to the common sense, verse 24. When he says, ye see, that's an appeal to the common sense. A man is not declared to be innocent by faith only. His faith must be demonstrated. Romans 3:28 does not conflict with this passage.
so much of the denominational world now is using the word believer. Oh, that person's a believer. Kind of like the way they use Christian is anybody who believes in Christ.
All right, verse 25. Likewise also was not Rahab the harlot justified by works, when she had received the messengers and had sent them out another way. I'm going to tell you something about Rahab the harlot. Did she change her ways?
She had to.
She was in the lineage of Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 1, but she's still called what? All right. Another example is that of Rahab. This is Joshua chapter 2. She was not a prostitute after accepting what God wanted people to do. Matter of fact, if you go back in Joshua chapter 2, she understood 40 years earlier what God had done for his people, how they had left Egypt, and what she had done, what God had done for his people. And she even brings that up. And she welcomes then the spies, and she knew what God was going to do. Thus she hid the spies. She protected them and enabled them to escape safely. She is mentioned in Hebrews 11:31. She performed an invaluable service, which she performed gladly and effectively. And she is also listed in the genealogy of our Lord, Matthew chapter 1 and verse 5. Then verse 26. For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. The body is dead without the spirit. The mortal without the immortal is dead. Dead is lifeless and without breath. It is a separation. Isaiah 59 verses 1 and 2. Because this is so, then it is so that faith without works is also dead. This is written to Christians and applies to them as well. We must continue to show our faith by doing what God has commanded us to do. What has God commanded us to do? Worship, personal evangelism, doing good to others. And if we do not do these in our lives, then we are nothing more than spiritual corpses, destitute of all life. All right. I think we'll just close out since we're through right there, and we'll start then next week with James chapter 3. This will be, tonight is the 9th, and 7 and 9 is 16, is it not? All right. We'll see y'all next week.
Usually this time fly by so fast. I was so cold. I could so